Around 1660, the Grand Tour became a popular pastime for young upper-class men in order to complete their education and to see the fine examples of art and different cultures in Europe. Most were accompanied by a chaperone for the duration of their tour. We know of the travels through the artwork and antiques that they collected, as well as letters that they sent home. By the 1770s, the middle and mercantile classes were also touring, sometimes for pleasure, sometimes for business, and sometimes a mixture of both. This second group of tourists were often expected to keep a journal, as they had little money to purchase souvenirs. Although many people associate the Grand Tour with adding to the collections of artwork at stately homes, this talk will look into the more basic elements of the tour, such as travel and sightseeing, using many letters and diaries from the collections within the Norfolk Record Office. The initial tour lasted usually 1 or 2 years and incorporated a trip to Paris and a tour of the principal Italian cities, such as Rome, Venice, Florence and Naples. Only the very wealthy could partake a tour of these areas in the absence of public transport in Italy, which made the journey incredibly long and costly. Once the less affluent tourists began taking advantage of the Grand Tour, the routes changed. These tourists preferred to take a shorter and less expensive alternative to Italy, and so increasingly after this date, the Grand Tour began to include the Low Countries. These second tourists might include places such as Vienna in Austria, Dresden and Berlin in Germany, and Brill in the Netherlands. Routes were not just dependent on money, though. They also depended on climate constraints. For example, people avoided travelling through places in winter during the snow, which sometimes cut off some routes completely. They also avoided the summer heat. Many tourists also went out of their way to see some of the local events, such as carnivals and festivals. The initial thoughts of the Grand Tourist were how to get to the continent. Most tourists went to Dover and crossed to Calais. However, it was common to go to other places in France, such as Dover to Boulogne. At times of Anglo-French tension, tourists would cross further east, for example going from Dover to Ostend. At Dover, they could either use the packet boat, which carried the Royal Mail and would take paying passengers, or make an arrangement with captains of local boats. Most of the gentry were terrified of the crossing, as they'd never been to sea before, and many of the boats were poorly stabilised. The three main difficulties were adverse winds or calm, seasickness, and problems with disembarkation. John Patterson completed his Grand Tour in the late 18th century, travelling with a companion called Collier. He wrote to his mother Martha on the 3rd of April 1778 on arrival at Brill. He writes, "Thank God we have had the finest passage it was in the power of wind and weather to give us. About 30 hours from going on board. At 12 o'clock on Thursday till 6 this evening at sea, a brick wind for the first day and calm all night. I could not prevail upon my stomach to be sick for the first 5 hours. I was in a most disagreeable state, neither sick nor well for some time, till at last I shared the same fate with Collier and his man. After this circumstance I cheered up, prated upon deck until the cold drove me to bed at about 8 o'clock. I should have slept very well had I not been awoke by the tuneful pipe of a child of 4 months old, and the still more harmonious noise of the nurse and mother to quiet it. I wished the poor little animal further from me, yet could not be so angry as to not pity it, and the poor mother who appeared to feel gratefully for it." It was said that a cure for seasickness was chewing on ginger or peppermint. Dr. Johnson also advised that the best cure was to wrap your arms around an oak tree. Once on the continent, the early travellers used carriage, boats, or even mules, depending on the area they were crossing. In the 18th century, transportation in Europe was well developed, and the roads were good in both France and the Netherlands. There were several different ways that tourists could get hold of carriages. They could hire a private carriage and horses, however this was expensive. They could rent a carriage and travel by post. This meant that they hired horses and a driver at designated stations spaced every 6 to 7 miles along main roads. This system was well developed by the 1760s, with detailed rules regarding the number of horses and men required for different types of coaches, and the intervals at which they had to be changed. Guidebooks listed every post station and major intercity routes, and included detailed maps. Most posting stations also doubled as inns. This system allowed the comfort of private travel without the expense and responsibility of maintaining your own coach and horses. However, there were several disadvantages to this system. Firstly, fresh horses were not always available. Secondly, some horses were kept in reserve for noblemen. And thirdly, some tourists complained of being overcharged and rudely treated. The final way of getting round was by public transit, known as diligence. This resembled 3 coaches hitched together with a platform across the top for luggage and extra passengers. They could carry up to 30 people and travel between major cities in France, following regular but slow schedules. The German equivalent was known as the post wagon. Getting started sometimes led to a delay on the tour itself. John Patterson arrived in Brill at the start of his grand tour and writes, "We feel ourselves perfectly well, only long much to get our chaise, that we made use of this afternoon being no better than a common farmer's wagon, the severe jolting of which we expect to have some small remembrance of tomorrow." Once people had a carriage, the idea of driving on the right also caused some concern. M. Derbyshire visited Naples in 1788 and explains, "The carriages we saw on the road were chiefly a sort of gig to hold one person, with 1 and sometimes 2 horses, the driver standing behind and flourishing a long whip over the head of the person in the carriage, who always holds its reins, and is a universal practice for the driver in an open carriage to sit on the wrong side and pass the carriages in the same way." The Guns' experiences of travelling by post led to a traumatic experience. On the 4th of September 1792 they went along the coast road from Marseille and stopped at Fréjus to see the amphitheatre. Anne writes, "We had the same mountainous country and the road very bad indeed, and the Fréjus horses very unequal to the journey. We were to have crossed Listorel and slept at Cannes, but the postillion was unacquainted with the road, or he would have never attempted it. Night came on, it rained very fast, and we were stuck upon the mountains, where I would have willingly stayed until morning. We had soon occasion to wish that we had determined to do so, for in 10 minutes we were overturned, but thank God none of us hurt worth mentioning. The coach lay partly over the edge of the road, a very little more and we should have been down the bottom of the precipice, or if we had been going faster we would very likely be. I shall never forget what I felt like at the time, nor how surprised when it stopped. I believe now that the man was asleep, for there was a great stone 1 yard high laid in the road, which was very plain to see. We got out as well as we could, thankful that we were none of us hurt. But then what was to be done? There was no horseman, and the coach could not be got up without assistance, nor did they like to leave it alone. So we sent the coachman to the post, which was 2 or 3 miles off, and the rain drove us into the coach again, much against my inclination. And I shall never forget what dreadful manner the time just before anyone arrived, for I felt every minute as if I was going to roll down the precipice. In less than 2 hours he returned, to my great relief, with 9 men, and with some difficulty they raised the coach, which had sustained no injury, and we all set off on foot, as I was determined to ride no more. But we came on to level ground at last, and I was quite done for, and glad, though afraid, to get in it again. Once the tourists had arrived at Lyon, they had the problem of how to get around the Alps. Tourists had to choose between crossing over the Alps or going via the Mediterranean. The majority of tourists preferred to cross the Alps, although this was more affected by seasonal factors. The earlier tourists tended to go over Mount Cenis Pass. In order to do this, they had to dismantle their carriages, which were then carried on mules, and the tourists themselves were carried over on sedan-like chairs. Patterson wrote, "It is now between 12 and 1, and I hope Mrs. Patterson will excuse Mount Cenis till sunrise. At the foot of this celebrated mountain I was given to understand that the passage across was attended with great difficulty and danger, that the cold would be extreme and the weather being very indifferent, the first snow having fallen the preceding night, it would be much better for me to be carried over. 6 men therefore were provided for this task. It rained when I set off. You could not have resisted laughing to see what a figure I cut, riding in a little armchair upon 2 poles carried by 2 men, enveloped in the stoutest suit of cloth I had, my thunder and lightning greatcoat over that, and Mr. Reed's wrapper all over. A pair of boots and 2 pairs of worsted stockings for my legs, my white travelling cap, and a hat over that for my head. The ascent is about 3 miles and very steep. I could not but be surprised to see with what agility the men, alternatively relieving and assisting each other, performed with ease what would have demolished the rest of the world. The first cloud passed. I took compassion on the poor creatures, and finding it neither so dangerous or cold as I was made to believe, I quit my great chair for a mule's back, and threw off my great coat and one hat. This plain is surrounded with still higher mountains ever covered with snow. The post house, a hospital, many shepherds' huts, and near the descent an inn called the Great Cross divides Savoy from Piedmont, and they are the only buildings. This is the last place I stopped to taste a trout and refresh my carriers. Again I seated myself in the chair and was conveyed down in 2 hours. The descent is reckoned 6 miles. To avoid the mountains, grand tourists would travel south to Marseille or Cannes, where a felucca, a flat-bottomed boat, would be hired to take them to Genoa. For those who decided to pass the Alps by going from France to Italy by sea, there were other problems, including storms, shipwreck, and to a lesser extent pirates. William Gunn decided to go from Nice to Leghorn in a felucca. He writes to John Blofield on the 25th of February 1785 on one of his tours of the continent, describing this passage. He writes, "I embarked in a felucca at Nice for Leghorn, with a wind that would have carried us in 48 hours. But we had been leagues out at sea before it changed, and having put in at a number of little dirty seaports, at the end of 3 days we were no further than Genoa." Not all sailors and vessels that could be hired were thought to be capable. John Patterson got a boat from Naples to Palermo. He writes, "On the 22nd, at night, with the other 5, went on board the Swedish vessel. My hammock was fastened, and the 5 laid on the floor. We passed rather an unpleasant night, and to our great mortification found ourselves in the same place as when we came on board. We were 2 days beating about the bay, and 5 others before we arrived at Palermo. You may easily imagine this has not been a very pleasant week, for though the weather was fine, and none of us sick, though a little squeamish, sea work is so dull and tiresome we almost began to be out of patience, and, had we known what we saw on entering the harbour, we should have abused our captain not a little. A little English slop left Naples 3 days after us, and arrived at Palermo 2 days sooner. Our captain was rather mortified to see him, and we pressed him so close he was obliged to confess that English vessels were the best sailors, but that his was sure but slow." Visiting the classical ruins was one of the main reasons for visiting Italy in the 18th and 19th centuries. An area that became increasingly popular with tourists after the 1730s was the Bay of Naples, to the southwestern part of Italy. This was due largely to the discoveries of Herculaneum in 1738 and Pompeii in 1748, 2 towns buried by the eruption of Vesuvius, giving future generations a good insight into Roman life. A letter written by George Sherlock to Thomas Cook gives an account of the discovery of Herculaneum around 1730. He writes, "Before I give such a description of these remains as I am able, it must first be necessary to acquaint you with that, for fear of accidents, the passages they have dug out, which have been quite a venture, are seldom higher or broader than is necessary for a man of my size to pass along conveniently. These passages are quite a labyrinth. There is no guessing at whereabouts you are after 2 or 3 turnings. We soon perceived ourselves to be got into the inside of a dwelling house. The rooms appear to have been but small. They are lined with stucco and painted with a round of deep red, adorned with compartments either of white or light yellow, and of some other colours. Our lights were not good enough to make us distinguish. In these compartments were grotesque paintings of birds, beasts, masks, and the like. This room may have been about 10 or 12 feet high, but the danger of our situation would not permit us to do otherwise than to get out of it as soon as we could." He goes on to explain that they thought the town was burnt and buried by the mountain, and that the townspeople must have had some warnings, as they had not discovered any bodies. Since this letter was written, there has been a discovery of bodies at Herculaneum, but not until 1981, when they discovered bodies on the beach and in the boat chambers. They are assuming that these people were sheltering, trying to get away from the eruption. However, George Sherlock's views were not shared by other tourists. John Patterson, on his trip of 1779, states, Herculaneum and Pompeii are worth seeing when on the spot, but I don't think them worthy subjects to take a man a mile out of his way. In his diary of 1824, Henry Woodhouse writes, "Went underground with mutton candles in hand, and saw nothing worth seeing." Throughout people's journeys there are continuous mentions of Vesuvius being on the verge of eruption. M. Derbyshire records her trip to Vesuvius in 1788, describing the scene one night from the balcony of her lodgings. She writes, "I had the pleasure of seeing the fire come out of the crater and run a considerable way down the side of the mountain. They were like little burning particles in the sea, like glowworms." Despite the lava flow, the group decided to climb Vesuvius the next day. At the top of the mountain, she writes, "We sat down to eat some hard eggs we had brought with us, during which a throw from the crater sprinkled us and our provisions with little cinders. The waiter trembled for fear and advised us to go down immediately. We did not take his advice, but proceeded. This part is nothing but immense pieces of cinder, but very hard. When we got to the top, an amassing thick smoke from the crater, with strong sulphureous smell, almost stifled us. We held our handkerchiefs to our mouths and covered our eyes, but still it got down my throat so much and made me cough that I began to be in great agony, and set off to go down. The smoke was so thick that I could not see one of the company, though I heard them talk very distinctly. In about 5 minutes the smoke cleared, and I went again on the opposite side to the wind, and was highly gratified. When I saw into the crater there was no opening. The smoke issued from 3 different parts. The edge was as sharp as if cut with a knife. The bottom appeared only about 50 feet deep. We found the situation very warm. Our dog, who went with us, cried terribly, and Morgan was obliged to hold him in his arms. The sulphur made him so sick that he vomited. A little lower down we saw a large mouth, out of which came a hot sulphureous steam, but not like that at the top, which was like mustard in one's throat, or that sort of thing. Our cicerone went down a little way to bring up some beautiful things which were uncrusted upon the stones. They were very like cauliflowers, and some tinged with yellow and brown. We were much distressed, as we found the poor man could not get up again. He was frightened, as he found he could not hold himself much longer. We made, therefore, a collection of handkerchiefs, and tying them all together with a string long enough to pull him up. Getting down, however, was much easier. She writes, "We did not look at what time it took us to get down, but it appeared very short, as I stuck my heels in the sand and slipped a yard or 2 at a time. I got, however, several falls by not being able to stop myself with running. My hands and wrists were scratched, but my feet came off very well. Miss Twist lost both her heels and almost all of the sole. Of course, her feet suffered extremely, and were bruised and cut a good deal." Some of the travels took the tourists through some dangerous places. One tourist, Thomas William Jex Blake, and his wife Henrietta had a particularly interesting story to tell when they were arrested for spying in 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War. Thomas and Hetty had been visiting the ramparts which formed part of the fortifications of Cizon. Thomas wrote in his diary, "Presently an officer came up, lifted his hat and invited me to come to the guard, as we had been walking around the fortifications. Some 10 or 12 nationals were there, and a soldierly captain of perhaps 35, who asked for my papers." Thomas and Hetty were accused of climbing the ramparts twice, despite being told not to climb them after the first time. He writes, "It was hard to keep cool with such determined lying on his part, but I did keep cool, and Hetty, to whom the commandants had given a chair at once, behaved beautifully. We did not speak a word of English to each other at all, for fear of seeming to be arranging trickery." They were accused of meeting someone in the cafe the night before, but they explained this was impossible, as they had entered Cizon at 3 and were arrested at 4:30. They were finally allowed to go when they produced their hotel bill for their stay the night before, which was elsewhere, and also papers for the whole trip, showing that their first night's stay in France was the 1st of July, before the war broke out on the 19th. Other tourists talked about sudden dangers when they were in countries not at war. E. F. Upcher reported in 1882, "The Venetians have a most dangerous practice of firing off a great cannon at 12 o'clock from the island of San Giorgio Maggiore, but this unfortunately we knew not. Suddenly there was a flash just 10 yards in front of our noses, and then such a roar. I have never got a prize for high jumping. When I get back to England I shall certainly write to the field and inform the world in general that I have now done the highest on record. When we had recovered our hats and our presence of mind, we looked out expecting our gondola in fragments, but he was actually smiling, the brute. It seems that although there were large numbers of different experiences on the Grand Tour, some good and some bad, there was nothing quite like coming home. On his return journey home, John Patterson stated, "I shall not attempt to enlarge upon what I have seen or done. I must only say I am glad at having passed through France, as I can now say I have made a complete tour, and when I set my foot on English ground I shall never wish to leave it again. Let me beg of you never to say anything against the French as a private person, for nothing can exceed the treatment we English experience from all ranks." In a later letter dated the 21st of November 1779 to his mother Martha, he writes, "I am very happy to be able to inform you of my safe arrival in England. I have not been half an hour on shore. My stomach is very squeamish, and I can say no more than I will make all possible speed to be with you soon. This is to be sent by tomorrow night's coach, in case I should not get to London, which is my intention."